today we're in Galatians 3. We're actually just simply looking at the very first verse today. The kind of discourse that's been occurring through the end of chapter 1 through chapter 2 that we finished off with in the last lesson has where much of it's been Paul kind of in this interaction that he's recounting in Antioch. He then has used that as the springboard to then launch into this particular discourse, kind of coming back, bringing his attention back or his focus back to the Galatians themselves. We're going to subdivide this chapter very, very heavily. In fact, we're going to be spending a lot of time in this specific chapter, really over the course of the next coming months, plural, will be in chapter 3, okay? But today, verse 1, before he then starts to expand from verse 1 through verse 2 and following, okay? So I'll read and then we'll go from there. So Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified? Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, there's a couple of reasons why we're just looking at the one verse, apart from the fact that it serves as a kind of rhetorical device on Paul's part as he is writing and compiling this particular letter. It transitions, obviously, as I mentioned in the introduction, between the discourse that came before. If we're turning it, I'll give you a second to find that one. All good. No drama at all. Go ahead. I thought everyone was already there.
Go for it.
Yep, all good. So you're coming immediately after. If you find the letters to the Corinthians, you'll be just after that. And if you hit, I believe it is Ephesians, yep. Yeah. So between Ephesians and 2 Corinthians.
This is a weird Bible.
Must be, yep.
Do you know what I discovered?
What?
This is, and you're going to go, oh, you should have known this. And you're right, I should have. But because I've neglected my Bible for so long, particularly the Old Testament, I'm working my way through. I know it's not how you should do it, but I just am doing it that way. So
no, it's not a bad way of doing it, actually. You should actually probably start at the beginning.
So I know I've covered everything. So I'm in Joshua.
Yep.
And he's just... I can now see why Moses probably, I think he dodged a bullet actually, going into the promised land with all the fighting and all the battles and stuff. But I'm at the point then where they cross the Jordan.
Yep.
And God stops the water.
Correct, yeah.
For the new generation, just like he did
with Exodus,
the Exodus of the first one.
Yeah.
It was like an epiphany.
Yeah.
It was like, oh wow, how cool is that?
Yeah, correct.
He did it twice.
Twice, yeah. No, that's it's meant to mirror that, yep.
That's
we there?
Very cool.
All good? Cool. No drama at all. All good. I should have checked that. That's my fault. Anyway, I'll start again. So, yes. So this verse transitions us, obviously, apart from chapter 2 to chapter 3, from the previous discourse into the one that then follows. This discourse runs its way through two primary sections, basically through to verse 14, and then the kind of second half of it from verse 15 all the way through to the end of the chapter, which, as I said in the intro, we're going to be spending a couple of months here in this chapter, at least. So the reason why we want to elucidate is for that, so the rhetorical function that it actually has. Secondly, moreover, is the kind of rhetoric itself. And I mentioned this all the way back at the very beginning of this study, that there would be times, like there'll be different elements that will be focused on as to why we're looking at a certain verse or group of verses. Sometimes it will be for the kind of theological aspects, so the theological content. Others will be the rhetorical aspect as well, and sometimes it'll be both. Here it's one of those cases where it's primarily the rhetorical function, but also has some important theological elements that extend far beyond just this singular book. Hence why we're able to just look at one verse for a lesson here. So I'll begin as obviously this sentence begins. He refers to them as the foolish Galatians. Oh, foolish Galatians. We highlighted at the very, very beginning in the introduction of the book, back in verses kind of 1 to 5 and then 6 to 10, which is where we initially started off, obviously in chapter 1. Those are the first two letters. But when we're looking at that first lesson, verses 1 to 5 of chapter 1, one of the things that was highlighted was the fact that in a unique kind of contradistinction to his other letters, where he refers to the Christians in XYZ city, Colossae, Thessalonica, etc., Corinth, of course, as well as elsewhere, he refers to them in rather endearing terms, familial language of brotherhood and fellow saints, etc. Whereas in this book he does not because he doesn't believe that they are, but because of the serious problem that they're facing, and their own hand in having allowed it to fester and develop to the point at which it was at this juncture. And this is one such example, right? So he doesn't refer to them as brothers. He refers to them obviously as by their name, by their people, right, the Galatians. But he refers to them with this word, foolish, right? Oh, foolish Galatians, anoetoi, plural, meaning the ones who are fools. I want to spend a little bit of time kind of explaining what that means and why he decides to employ that, so that we can help understand much of his point that comes in the rest of the sentence. Noetos, meaning to understand something. It's quite a generic word with this alpha prefix a. We're familiar with this word, or this usage, from modern English words like atheist, so from the Greek theos, meaning God, atheos, atheist, atheist, one who says there is no God, okay? So that convention in Greek is something that's flowed forward into a number of English words. Right? By putting the letter alpha or a, it's a negative prefix, right? So no, whatever the root word is. So the one who is anoetos, or anoetoi plural, is the one who is without knowledge, or the one specifically, to be more precise, the one who is without thinking. No thinking would be a really blunt way of phrasing it, okay? Which is a common word in ancient Hellenistic sources, used very routinely, especially among philosophical writers, to describe one who does not think. Now, one thing that's interesting in this regard is that it is different, or it's distinct from a seemingly similar word, but a different word, of moros, M-O-R-O-S, if you want to think of it that way, which is where we get the English word moron from. Okay, moros, moron. That word is used in the ancient world, in the ancient Greek world, to describe someone who is incapable of thinking. So in other words, someone who is what we would just call stupid, right? It's used to describe, and again, very common, again, it's used by Aristotle, it's used by Plato, it's used by Demosthenes and a whole host of other figures in ancient Greek sources. The distinction with that word compared to this one, which is where we get the operative word translated into English as fool, or foolishness in this case, or foolish, it's an adjective, it's in the adjectival form here, is used to describe someone who is capable of being rational, capable of thinking, but either chooses not to or simply just fails to do so. Okay, and that might seem like a minor difference, but in fact it's actually quite a significant one. Words historically in English like idiot or moron were actually scientific descriptors to describe different categories for those who were mentally impaired from birth or from an accident or various other such things. But the word fool is, because of this ancient Greek context, used to describe someone who should know how to think properly, who should know how to look at the facts at hand or at the evidence, or again, whatever the context is, and arrive at an accurate conclusion using their God-given faculties for human reason. Right? But in failing to do so, again, either through lack of willingness or just through the failed attempt, does not do so. Okay, that distinction, anoetos or anoitos rather, to moron, helps us understand why he's applying this particular term here. Okay, he's not describing the Galatians as simply being pure victims of circumstance, for example. He's not describing them as being the unknowing, unwilling victims of those who have crept in among them, those who have decided to sow the kind of division and heresy that we've been seeing, right, throughout the first 2 chapters thus far. He's rather instead, by virtue of using this kind of adjective to describe them, foolish Galatians, he is describing them as having a hand in it, right? A minor one compared to the others, but ultimately still very much a real role in this. Does that make sense? Yep. And that's not just simply subjective opinion, it's because of his word choice. Okay, if he wanted to describe them elsewise or otherwise, he would use a different term like moros. Okay, rather it is the description of one who has the requisite ability to be able to determine right from wrong, to determine truth from falsehood, and either chooses not to or fails to do so. Okay, that is the essence of a fool. Right? It is one who fails, by whichever means, to abide in truth. Okay? That is the fool. It's the one who rejects it, and rejects it with capability. Okay. Now, it might seem harsh that he's using this kind of adjectival description. Again, after all, keeping in mind these people here have been Christian for only a couple of years. Kind of 2-ish years, roughly speaking, at the top, right? Everyone here, from their parishioners to their bishops, their elders, their ministers, have been Christian for no more than, like I said, about 2-ish years, roughly speaking, right? Is then the description of them being foolish harsh? Well, apparently not. Okay. And he does this by virtue of the fact that of what he then says afterwards. He doesn't just kind of throw this term out, right? He explains this by virtue of what comes at the end. So the way we're going to go through this verse now, this sentence now, is actually by jumping to the end portion, and then we're going to finish with the middle, right? O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified, right? So he describes them as foolish, as having the ability to know and to understand, and yet failing to do so, or rejecting to do so, rejecting the need or the impetus to do so, on account of who Jesus Christ was and what Jesus Christ did as being publicly portrayed to them. Now, naturally, these Galatians, again, we talked in introduction to this book about their ethnic background and history as Celts, distantly related Celts here. None of these folk would have been in Jerusalem by all likelihood when Jesus Christ was crucified, right? When he was buried and when he was raised from the dead. However, the public proclamation of this is what he is utilizing. This phrase, again, most of your translations should say publicly portrayed or something to that effect. Yeah. Again, a commonly used phrase, fairly commonly used phrase in the ancient world to describe something that was displayed publicly. So often, especially during this period of history, imperial decrees, okay, from the Romans would be described routinely, or quite commonly at least, using this phrase that we're translating publicly portrayed. So an imperial decree, say from a governor or from a local legate from military barracks, etc., whichever magistrate it happened to be from the empire, would display a new law or a new tax code or, an announcement of some kind. a public demonstration, right, or a public proclamation that would then be posted somewhere, right, in the town or in a village, on a highway often as well, in fact. And that could range from those things all the way through to just kind of general Roman imperial propaganda, et cetera, concerning the emperor. So this was not something that was hidden. This didn't happen in some far-flung corner of the world per se. Obviously, the Roman province of Judea was in the eastern extent of the empire, but Jerusalem was, as we well know, a major city in the ancient world, of course, with a sizable population and the largest population east of essentially Byzantium, right, as it was known at the time, what would go on to become Constantinople. This happened very, very publicly in front of tens upon thousands of people, with the Roman authorities, of course, Pontius Pilate actively involved, etc., etc. He was buried publicly in a very public tomb from a wealthy patron, Joseph of Arimathea, of course. And his resurrection was likewise very public, again appearing obviously to his 12 disciples as well as 500 other people, who would then go on to very publicly proclaim that they also saw him, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And his tomb you can still go visit to this day, right? So all this is very public. So then the notion of that publicity further extends to, of course, the Apostle Paul's journeys to, in this context for us, Galatia, right, to the 4 major cities in southern Galatia. We've covered that context before. And publicly proclaiming that which, as we've seen for those of you who were in our previous study, when he would come into a new major city, he would often be met by local Jews in those cities, and they would have already heard long before of Jesus and everything about him, etc., etc. So the phraseology that he's using here is why he decides to begin with a rather harsh yet accurate and true description of them, right, as foolish, okay? O foolish Galatians, right? Before whose eyes, right, in other words, publicly demonstrated to you, Jesus Christ was, as it says, publicly portrayed as crucified, okay? And again, some of the implications of that phrase will then become more apparent as he unpacks this in the rest of the chapter. We'll make those points when we get there. That's the basis upon which he's calling them foolish. He's not calling them foolish because they were unaware of something that had happened in secret, and so their unawareness would be naturally, understandable. Someone's not a fool for not knowing something that people don't know. People are foolish for, much as this phraseology suggests, rejecting that which can be seen with their eyes. Now, we've covered this kind of concept before about about the kind of typology or the symbology of the eyes before, right? Especially in the ancient world. That language does not only mean that which you're literally seeing physically with your eyes, it's also that which you can understand. The eyes in the ancient world being, as we have an English phrase have a phrase in our own English language, right? The eyes are the window to the soul. Okay, that's from that more ancient context, right? Through seeing we perceive, and through perception we know, and through know we understand. Knowing we understand, right? That chain of knowledge. Before their own eyes. Now, his usage of the phrase eyes is actually a bit of a pun for a reason, which we'll get onto when we talk about this word bewitchment, right, or who bewitched you. It's a play on word that he's using for reasons I'll make clear later on. But to publicly display them before their eyes, again, they didn't physically see Jesus, okay? None of these people did. But the historical testament of what happened from eyewitnesses has been made known to them, okay? And again, that element of eyewitness is obviously central to the Gospels, because they're coming on account of, or in the case of Matthew and John, 2 literal eyewitnesses. In the case of Mark and of Luke, they're coming from direct sources who were themselves eyewitnesses, particularly Peter, okay? Especially in the case of Mark. Luke, multitudes of eyewitnesses. So those in Galatia, though they haven't seen physically with their eyes, have had this told to them by someone who did see this with his own eyes, Paul. Okay. None of this is coming because someone had an esoteric vision in a cave. Okay? None of this is coming from someone who went high up on a mountain and spent a couple of months there and then came back with an entirely new religion or philosophy. Okay? It's not coming from a singular individual experiencing something that they themselves only experienced, right? It is coming from a group, a plurality, a confluence of people of different background, of different standing, of different context, who all saw and identified the same things. Okay, which is, of course, just one more in the infinite list of things that distinguish Christianity from everything else. Okay? In this case, he himself, Paul, is one such person, right? Again, who saw this with his own eyes, surrounded by a group of soldiers who also were there alongside him. Again, even his own experience of eyewitness testimony didn't happen in isolation either, right? And so it is in that sense that it has been portrayed publicly before their eyes, okay, to their knowledge and to their understanding, right? They've heard everything that's happened. They're not under any misunderstanding as to what happened in the life and work of Jesus of Nazareth, right? They know it, they've heard it, they've had it told to them by people who were there, who saw it, who understood it, who lived through it, right? Not people who heard it from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone, but people who actually lived through it, right? Hence why, as we sit here 2 millennia later, we're not purely getting this from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone. We're getting it from the actual people who were there, right? Hence their foolishness, okay? They're not incapable of not understanding. So they're not incapable of understanding, right? So it's not a mental, it's not an issue of cognition or of mental capacity or of defect in kind of logical and rational process. No, they're entirely capable, especially by virtue of the grace of God and of the Spirit of God, who again reveals all truth to us. They're not incapable of using the inherent God-given faculties for logic, right? Logos, right? No, it's simply that they have turned away and stepped off the path of that which had been shown to them prior to, and that is foolishness, right? To have the truth articulated and demonstrated to you, conclusively so, and to then reject that is foolishness. To reject truth once you have had it presented to you is the essence of foolishness, and that would go in any context, okay? Someone who, again, to use a grotesquely oversimplified example, the high school student who has a rather elementary, math equation shown to them, and decides that they don't like the answer and that they want the answer to be something else is not stupid. They're not a moron, as per the more ancient context of that word, right? Someone who is incapable. Rather, they are a fool. Okay, someone who sees truth demonstrated before them, who has received knowledge and yet rejects it, is a fool, right? To call that person a fool is not inaccurate, it's not uncharitable, it's not mean, it's not any of these other kind of descriptors that we then apply largely to make ourselves feel better, are all quite frankly irrelevant.
So he's not necessarily being sarcastic, he's actually being truthful.
He's not even faintly. Well, there is. He's not being sarcastic. There is an element of. There is a rhetorical element here in the word bewitched, but I'll explain that later. But no, he's not being sarcastic nor ironic. He's being blunt. Yeah. the way in which foolishness is averted and otherwise overcome is by actually illuminating that foolishness. Now, that is often a more difficult task than one might like, but it is a necessary task nonetheless. Right? We as human beings have an incredible propensity for foolishness. We have a remarkable track record of having truth presented and then rejecting it for a whole host of reasons, again, depending on context, depending on person, depending on male or female, depending on a variety of different factors as to why that's rejected. Largely it is because we often can't stand the cognitive dissonance that exists between what we think is accurate versus what is actually accurate, and that chasm might be small, that chasm might be rather large. But alas, the way that we as people are able to traverse that canyon of cognitive dissonance between what we think is real versus what we now realize is actually real is humility. It's humility. Pride is what hinders us in our ability to overcome that roadblock, as it were. Okay. Again, pride, of course, and there's a reason. And again, there's the reason why throughout the history of Western civilization, pride has been very consistently identified as the cardinal vice, as the chief vice, right? The sin that begets all sin, as it were. The evil that begets all evil, because it is ultimately pride that hinders us in our ability, or our propensity rather, to move from falsehood into truth, right? From darkness into light. Because one of the most fundamental components that's required for that movement is the acknowledgement that you're actually wrong. Okay. And the only way in which to avert that is by maintaining a posture of humility that recognizes that you are not infallible. Right? Human beings have the ability to be inerrant, so that is to say without error. Right? So again, to use stupidly oversimplified examples, if someone sits down and says that 2 + 2 = 4, that's an inerrant statement, right? It is without error. Okay. To say that the sky is blue and the grass is green and that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west are also likewise very low-hanging fruits. That is an inerrant statement, right? It is a statement. It's a remark that is without error. Okay, that does not occur because I am infallible. In other words, incapable of error. Right. So the difference of being without error versus incapable. One is describing function, the other is describing nature. Does that make sense? Yeah. None of us are infallible, individually or collectively. We are able to be without error, but it's not by virtue of the fact that we are incapable of error. There is only one who is incapable of error, and that is God. Okay? And again, that's for metaphysical reasons, which we've touched on before. Because God is the very source of truth, he is therefore the one that defines it. He's the arbiter of what is right and wrong. He is the arbiter, the definer and the metric of what is good and evil. He is not bound by some kind of external metaphysical standard of good and evil because he is the standard. Right? We have an external standard, and that is him. The definition of right and wrong, of truth and error, etc., is external to us. It's not internal. We are plagued in our time by a very postmodernist kind of philosophical understanding of truth and error that posits that it is a subjective enterprise confined to our own individual mind. Itself, again, a legacy largely of kind of Enlightenment era empiricism, that the only way we're able to determine what is true is through our 5 senses, right? That which we're able to see and hear and touch and smell and taste. And the failings of that idea, again, even in contradistinction to the rationalist school, but simply the empiricist school, which came to very heavily predominate in certain areas of Western Europe, has traversed down to our time in the ability that the only way we're able to understand is through our own individual interaction with the world around us. The problem with that is the fact that it confines, well, there's many problems with that philosophically, but the primary problem is the fact that it confines our understanding of truth to the individual level, right? Which, apart from a whole host of other problems, fails to account for common experience, at least totally. It fails to account for how, for example, over 500 people can see a guy who was crucified 3 days prior now walking around, right? People who didn't know each other, people who were not. It wasn't 500 people who were all part of the same country club. It was 500 different people, different families, different places of origin, etc., etc. And that's just initially. And the only plausible example that's ever been presented outside the fact that it happened is some kind of mass simultaneous hallucination, which at this stage has never been demonstrated to have occurred either in psychology, psychiatry, or elsewhere. Right? Pointing this out is to help us understand what this distinction is that exists in regards to capability of understanding. The inerrancy and infallibility distinction, so the fact that we as people can be without error in a concept, but it's not by virtue of the fact that we are infallible, is what actually helps us to build upon and at the same time even bring about, right, so it goes both ways, the requisite humility that's required for, in the context of this passage, avoiding foolishness. Okay. Yep, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's also this aspect of us that once we've had something ingrained,
Yep.
we believe this and this is how it's been for so long, we can't accept change. We don't want to see something new.
Much of it's like that, yeah. No, good point. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of that is, yes, the longer one has held a particular view about XYZ thing, that in this context of this example is erroneous or just otherwise false for whatever reason. The longer one has held to that view, the more ingrained, as we would say, the more calcified it is in our way of thinking, in our worldview, in the way in which we actually live in the world and interact therein. And of course, the longer that exists, or the longer that persists over the course of years or even decades in our life, the more painful it is to break away from that, right? Everything I'm saying here, by the way, is kind of, and there's all kinds of examples in life that would be easy to kind of point to. One such would be, of course, why it is so difficult for people to break out of cults, would be one such example. Of whatever kind. Just from a sheer statistical perspective, there is a very interesting relationship between kind of the percentage likelihood of someone leaving a cult vis-a-vis as a ratio to how long they've actually been in that group for, in that cult for. You essentially see from the moment they join that cult, again, regardless of age, but we're talking adults here generally, you see a slow decline in the probability across the first 12 months, and then from the 12-month period it plummets, right? To the point where after 12 months of being in that cult, the probability of them leaving is statistically almost 0%. Right? Not because it's impossible, again, it's not literally 0, but it's statistically insignificant, right? It's very, very close to 0. And like I said, it's this slow decline across the first 12 months, and then it falls off a cliff down to nearly 0%. Because once that re-indoctrination has occurred, or indoctrination in this case, singular, has occurred, it becomes unfathomably difficult to break that, right? Because the full initiation and ingratiation of the group has occurred, a new paradigm has been built, a new reality and worldview has been adopted, and that now becomes the filter by which everything else is ever analysed, right? Including calls to leave the group and as to why it's a cult and why it's wrong and blah, blah, blah. Everything else is now filtered because after that 12 months, that new worldview and paradigm has been firmly ingrained, and it now becomes the lens through which those kinds of words are now filtered, and so that's much to the point you're making there. Yeah, it's that's again, we have plenty of English phrases like that, right? Old dog, new tricks, and all that jazz. That's very much what that's kind of touching on. Again, not because it's impossible. It's not at all. It's just simply talking about, from a purely mortal kind of human perspective, the percentage likelihood, the probability. Yeah. And so yes. Part of this that also impacts this as well. And it's one of the last points I want to make about this essence of foolishness. His description of them as foolishness, as foolish, right, as fools, is entirely distinct and quite frankly unrelated to their own sincerity. Okay. How sincere they are about anything in any of the content that's enumerated in this book is actually largely irrelevant. I say largely as opposed to entirely because of a very important distinction I want you to understand. That's valuable for anyone to understand, quite frankly. There is, of course, again, to employ yet another English idiom, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The reason why that phrase exists, apart from the fact that it's true, is a truism, as we would say, is the fact that it is describing the distinction that exists between intention and outcome. Okay, so what do I mean by that? The intention, the purpose that one has for doing or saying X, Y, Z, whatever happens to be. It could be a verbal comment, it could be an action. Again, all in the one. I'm just going to describe that all together for the sake of this remark. The meaning that one places in it, the value that one has in it, and the purpose, particularly, is really what I'm touching on. The purpose behind why one is doing that thing is not irrelevant entirely, right? Because it does speak to something. However, there is a distinction that exists, what we would call teleologically, in other words, with regards to purpose, right, and function, as well as ontologically, so with regards to nature, between the intention that one has behind doing something, so the purpose, versus the outcome. We as people can intend to do something good and yet in fact do something evil, okay? We can intend to operate truthfully, but in consequence, operate falsely, right? The opposite really is not capable of being done, at least not truly, where you intend to act falsely and deceptively but accidentally stumble into the truth. It doesn't quite work that way, at least not in that kind of specific, not in the same kind of way at least. But people all the time can absolutely intend to act with goodness and with truth, and yet in fact act with corruption and with falsehood, right? That distinction really only determines how one should be judged or assessed based on that, okay? What I mean by that is this. If someone intends to be truthful and accurate, but fails to do so and actually says something untrue, okay, it would be unjust to impugn their motives, right? So in other words, to characterize them as purposefully being deceptive or malicious, right? Because they're not actually doing that. They've lied, right? The consequence of their actions has been falsehood, but unintentionally so, okay? And that has a big impact on a lot of things, including even just on the interpersonal level, right? If someone is especially with regards to things like we talk about here, if someone sincerely believes something because they are under the impression or even they're convinced that that's true or accurate, when in reality it's not, and can be and not just in a subjective sense, but like can actually be accurately demonstrated to not be true, right? Maligning that person as deceptive is not fair, right? And would not be just. However, you can and should articulate that what they have said is not accurate, right? Now, again, when that happens, we run headfirst into the same kind of problem that I was addressing about 15 minutes ago, which is the same kind of cognitive dissonance that exists between what you think versus what's real, okay? That cognitive dissonance and the lack of humility that usually is the result of that, or both causes it and continues it in practice, is the same kind of distinction or problem that happens when one fails to make a distinction between who they are as a person versus, or not versus, but compared to what they believe, okay? Especially in regards to their identity. If someone has become so ingrained in what they think, and they have made that so central to their identity as a person, as an individual, especially, a movement away from that erroneous belief, erroneous worldview, something, that falsehood, can be made even that much more harder, right? Because again, pride binding those things and stopping that person from actually humbling themselves, right, and recognizing that they're wrong, okay? And so then, of course, naturally, when one is in that position where they're not actually operating with humility, but even without realizing it, sometimes acting quite pridefully, when one points out to that person that they're incorrect or that they're wrong, right, what you've said here or what you've done here is not right, blah, 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 whatever it is, it's taken as a personal attack, right, an attack on the person, right? And that's the very essence and heart of that first phrase, "O foolish Galatians," right? If the Galatians were to respond to that phraseology as in the kind of negative light that would say something to the effect of, Paul, you're personally attacking me. You're calling me evil. You're saying that I'm incapable of being right, or what, blah, blah, blah. They've already failed, because they're failing to make the accurate distinction between why he's calling them foolish in the first place. It's actually because they're capable of understanding, but they're failing to do so. So in the essence of calling them a fool, you're highlighting to the fool, in this case the Galatians, their own folly, as we would say obviously, in order to help them abandon that folly. Okay? There's a very interesting proverb actually in the Old Testament which seems contradictory. Answer a fool according to his folly. Do not answer a fool according to his folly. Why on earth does it say that? Okay? Do not answer a fool according to his folly. Answer a fool according to his folly. Well, which one is it? Do I answer the fool according to his folly, or do I not answer the fool according to his folly? To which the answer is yes. Okay? Do not answer the fool according to his folly. Answer the fool according to his folly. Why is that said? Well, it's said because the person who wrote it, fortunately, was not a fool. They're actually very clever. And they're describing two different circumstances in which two different approaches should be taken. Do not answer a fool according to his folly speaks to the reality and the actual kind of prudent strategic course of action, wherein answering a fool according to the foolish things they say, the irrational things, illogical things, things that don't actually make sense in total, can often be akin to having an argument with a brick wall. Because the reality is that you're saying things and none of that's getting through. Okay? The person the fool in question here that you're having this discussion or dialogue or debate or argument, not in a pejorative sense, but like argument in the sense of offering up arguments, has already determined a priori, in other words, prior to, this discussion, they've already determined that you're wrong and that they're right. Not even so much that you're wrong, just simply that they're right. And because they already know that they're right, anything you say is going to be wrong, because after all, I'm right. Okay? That a priori declaration, or that mindset, they wouldn't even need to say it, just that frame of thinking, again, is the filter by which everything you say to them will be filtered. Moreover, the irrational, illogical garbage that will come out, again, that might, again, to whatever degree, it might be very obviously irrational, so like prima facie, so on the face value, or it actually might be quite complex and sophisticated and sound accurate, but really isn't, right? Whatever degree of folly, will again be offered regardless of what you've said, okay? That kind of dialogue or that kind of interaction with a fool in that regard will simply put you into an infinite feedback loop where you make an argument or a point to that person, and if it smells even vaguely effective in regards to combating their point, the discussion will magically shift to an entirely different topic altogether. Okay? No answer will be given, no defense will be given, it will simply shift on to something either tangentially related or completely unrelated. Okay? And all of a sudden, you'll find yourself playing basically a game of kind of rhetorical whack-a-mole, where this pops up and you attempt to try and deal with that, and then another thing pops up and you attempt to deal with this, and then pops another one, right? The problem is that the problem in that scenario is that you're playing a losing game, okay? It doesn't work, and it can't work because discussions between us as people, regardless of quite literally any factor, require, and in fact actually demand, that both parties are operating in good faith in the first place. So by good faith I mean a number of things in this context. By good faith I mean both people are treating not only themselves but each other as human beings made in the image of God who are, among other things, capable of logic. Okay? Being made in the image of the one who is the Logos, right? Christ himself. Treating also each other as worthy of kind of just fundamental decorum and respect, civility, etc. Also treating each other as capable of learning and understanding, as well as self-referentially each person viewing themselves, so not this direction but internally now, as capable of error. In other words, not infallible, i.e. being fallible. Without at least those basic requisites, you're not having a good faith discussion, okay? The final factor that's required, which is more, it's kind of a building upon those fundamental pillars, is a willingness to be proven wrong. Okay, so it's part character, but more it's pragmatic, right? It's the humility that is required to be shown to be wrong, in this case publicly, even if it's just one-on-one, it's still with another human being, where now at least one other person on planet Earth knows that you're not infallible, right? That you are actually capable of being wrong, okay? And it's pride that, again, we're back to the same point, but it's pride that stops that, and it's humility that aids that, okay? All those factors, without that, you're not having a good faith discussion, right? If there's not good faith, any kind of contention or discussion or debate or dialogue about ideas of any kind, it's not just that it's fruitless, it's a waste of time, okay? So do not answer a fool according to their folly, because as yet another English idiom goes, you'll be dragged down to their level. Now, the very sentence that comes immediately after that sentence in that proverb, answer a fool according to his folly, is talking rather about a different approach to a similar scenario, which is highlighting to the fool their own folly. So answer a fool according to their folly equals demonstrate very clearly that they're a fool, and that they're behaving foolishly, and that they're thinking foolishly, and that what they're saying is wrong and foolish by extent. It's not just oh, you happen to be wrong. It's actual like foolishness, right? Not only for the fool themselves, but also actually for anyone who witnesses what gets said to the fool. Okay. In many settings, academic and otherwise of mine, the conversation with the person that I'm having over XYZ topic, be it specific religious topics, philosophical topics, etc., even entire, kind of apologetic context, so just Christianity and atheism or Islam or the conversation is not that I'm having is not really ultimately for the person that I'm individually discussing with, but rather for the 30, 40, 50 people that are standing around in a lecture hall or in a university campus, etc., who are listening to it, who are not actively participating in the conversation, so they're not locked into it, but they are almost, in a sense, kind of mentally speaking, hovering over the conversation and viewing it from like a bird's eye third party lens, if that makes sense. Where they're actually able to see the balance because they're not immediately locked into the conversation, and they're a step back from the canvas, as you might say, right? And so in that case, answering the fool according to his folly actually highlights why one's opponent is actually in error. And that person may not realize it at all because of their own folly, but other people who are not acting foolishly will witness that and understand the distinction between what one has said and what the other has said. Right?
Well, they know what they know, but they don't know why they know that. They don't know how they came to know that, or it was someone taught me. Someone taught that person, then someone taught them. But then what if the first person was wrong?
Sure, yeah, that can be a factor. Yeah, so that can be a factor. It doesn't have to be, but it can be a factor where. So that comes back to the point I was making about sincerity. Okay, someone can sincerely, genuinely believe X, Y, Z thing because that's entirely how they've been born and raised, right? So impugning their motives would be unjust, right? Impugning the consequence of their belief, in other words, the belief itself, not the individual, but the belief itself that they hold, is rightful, okay? But impugning their motives, they're not trying to be wrong, but they in fact are. Now, part of the counterbalance to this, which is really important in our time, is that there is a prevailing ethos that the sincerity of one's views or beliefs about anything, but especially in the context of religion, is essentially an impenetrable defense against any possible criticism whatsoever. Okay, so by that I mean that the critique of, among other things, religious belief in particular, is almost seen as inherently wrong, because how can you be so cruel as to criticize someone's sincerely held belief? The problem with that view, and again, this is the opposite end of the spectrum of what we've been talking about, right? But the problem with that view, the problem with that ethos, is that it inherently assumes that, again, in its very postmodern philosophical sense, that there is no ultimate truth, and that all that matters is what you sincerely hold to be true within the confines of the 6 inches between your ears. Okay? The problem is that's not how reality works. The problem is that every single one of us in the room right now, all 5 of us, can sit here and collectively agree that 2 + 2 = 5, and it's utterly immaterial to whether or not that's accurate. Okay? Because reality is actually objective by virtue of its externality. Again, it's the inherently incorrect understanding that has prevailed progressively so over the last 200 or so years, 200 to 300 years now, that truth is defined in, through and by the individual mind. Again, and how that's been viewed has evolved and morphed over the course of the last quarter of a millennium. And at every turn it fails to uphold itself and justify itself philosophically. Every single person on the planet, for that matter, can collectively agree that 2 + 2 = 5. And that does nothing to change the empirical mathematical reality that in this universe, 2 + 2 = 4. It's irrelevant as to how many people do or don't agree on that fact. Because truth is not determined by a democracy. It's not determined by a democratic vote. It exists external and transcendent to the human mind and the human constitution, the human being, right? And so then the sincerity issue, again, we're on the opposite of that spectrum of it being somehow unethical or immoral to critique someone's view simply because they hold it sincerely, assumes that actually nothing is true, and therefore anyone's view on anything is therefore immediately valid and beyond criticism, which is just, again, not a defendable position, especially not ultimately so. The reality is that there is truth, and then there is that which is not aligned with truth, which we call error. Okay, there is truth, and then there is everything else that's not true, and there is a distinction between those two things, and that distinction is not determined by anything within the confines of the human mind. In fact, as I said earlier, it's external to it. It's determined by the created order, which itself was ordered by the Creator. As the one who created it, he is the one who therefore becomes its arbiter and its definer, regardless of human opinion as to X, Y, or Z. Individual sincerity is not the ultimate determining factor as to whether or not something is real or true. It simply speaks to motive, right? And by the way, this concept, to wrap it up, is fundamental. Like what I'm saying here, this kind of distinction is fundamental to just significant portions of Western civilization, especially jurisprudence, right? So law. There is a reason why in our common law heritage, right, our British common law heritage, there is a distinction between what we would just colloquially call murder and manslaughter, okay? And it's entirely due to intentionality. That's why there's even degrees. Again, especially in societies that, again, are built off of the common law, including even mixing in elements of civic law, continental civic law, like America, for example. First, second, and third degree homicide, right, for example. Different degrees of manslaughter. Again, we have our own ways of articulating that in Australian jurisprudence as well. But that's ingrained in the common law system, right? Born out of a fundamentally and categorically biblical jurisprudence from early medieval England, that is entirely and solely and squarely based on exactly one source, and that's this. It's the distinction between those two things is overwhelmingly determined by intention, right? But also recognizes consequence. So simply the fact that you did not intend to bring about the death of said person doesn't determine whether or not you have to face justice. That's why manslaughter exists, right? So it's not murder or nothing. No, there is murder, and then there is a degree of separation between murder and nothing, which we colloquially refer to as manslaughter, okay? Where justice must be accounted for the loss of human life, whilst recognizing a distinction brought about by intentionality without discounting consequence, the death of the person, okay? So, foolish Galatians, because of that which has been displayed publicly before them, because they have had the knowledge of who Jesus was and what he had done revealed to them, proclaimed to them publicly about things which themselves were proclaimed publicly. They're not aloof to any of these things, right? And moreover, they're not incapable of understanding because they previously held to it. And now they've abandoned it to one degree or another because of the Judaizers. Okay? And he asked, and this is where we come to our final part, right? We said we'd get to the middle last. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Okay? Does anyone's translations after the words bewitched you have that you should not obey the truth?
No.
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 No, any modern English translations shouldn't. So there's a textual variant here. We've covered this kind of concept before. Textual variants are where there is as the name suggests, a variation in the text of the manuscripts. So not the original, but we're talking about the manuscripts that have been copied and preserved over the course of thousands of years now. We're not going to kind of go into the academic minutiae of the history of this textual variant. It's an interesting discussion in the ivory tower of academia, but isn't particularly pertinent to us here. There are ancient manuscripts that have this phrase of after who has bewitched you, that you should not obey the truth, and there are others that don't. Again, it's not a fault with the original. It's again, we've explained this nature of textual variant. When scribes, as they're copying this over the course of centuries and centuries on end, if they find a word spelt differently, or an additional phrase, or a different word, or even just part of the word that's different, the consistent practice on the part of those scribes who were copying and preserving the Bible was to include it rather than, discard it, and allow future scribes and theologians to figure out what's what, right? Because the danger in simply discarding it is that if it turns out you were wrong, it's now lost, right? As opposed to including it, and you can later on figure out what the issues are, it essentially kicks the can down the road, but in a good way, okay? Whether or not that you should not obey the truth, right? Who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, really only conforms with the point, doesn't contradict his point at all. In fact, it actually helps it. So like I said, the minutiae of the historicity of that singular phrase is really largely immaterial. There's no textual variant that changes that changes the theological point of a text, that even contradicts anything. That's what I'm saying. Most of these, 99% of textual variants are a word that was accidentally misspelt by a scribe who'd already been working 12 hours that day. In this context, I'm mainly just wanting to focus on the phrase, who has bewitched you? Again, it's a rhetorical phrase. But O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Evaskanen, meaning to put one under a spell, right? This kind of word, so this is actually the only time that it's used in the New Testament. So it's what we call a hapax legomenon, a word that's only used once. But again, like with just about every time I've ever made that point, the word is not unique in ancient Greek sources, so we have a very easy, straightforward way of understanding it. Aristotle uses this word quite often, in fact, actually, as do others as well, Demosthenes as well, but I'm familiar with it in the Aristotelian context. Aristotle uses this word to describe one who has come under a spell as a result of some evil action. The phrase itself is actually related to a very, very kind of common and widely used concept in the ancient Near Eastern world. So Egypt, Assyria, Mesopotamia, Persia, right? The Greeks, the Romans, etc. And one that actually still prevails in plenty of parts of the world today, in fact, known as the evil eye. So this concept, which arose out of ancient Mesopotamia, Babylon, etc., of an amulet in the form of an eye, a blue eye, which would protect you from curses and other such things of those kinds of natures. was a very, very common belief in the ancient world, and in fact, again, still is in plenty of parts of the world today. If you were to go to, it's still common in the Middle East and in Asia, and in some parts of South America as well, but certainly the Middle East and Africa and Asia is where it finds its predominance still. Wouldn't have even the faintest doubt that there'd be no shortages of shops here who would sell them. I wouldn't be able to point out which ones, but I would bet the farm. Again, they're usually in the form of, it's almost like a teardrop shape, blue, and then white, obviously like an eye, like the iris of an eye, right, and the blue internal, black internal, and the whole notion of Evanescen in this concept in the Greek of the evil eye protecting as an amulet, right? So kind of containing its own kind of magical properties in the ancient world, would then keep a watchful eye, which is where we get that whole concept from, right? Being vigilant. It's, again, we could go into this quite deeply, in fact, across multiple lessons, but even this notion of a serpent, right, which is obviously the ubiquitous, universal imagery of evil in the ancient world. Again, reasons we've explained here before as well, right? Things which obviously play themselves out very frequently, of course, in the Bible. Part of that is by virtue of the actual meaning of the word across different languages in the ancient world, including saraf in the Semitic context, so Hebrew, Aramaic, etc., as meaning one that is watchful, right? So there's this inherent link in the etymology of the word serpent, going back into the ancient world, of one that has a long gaze and a watchfulness. It's especially related to other such words like, again, much in alignment with that serpentine imagery, the very ancient kind of concept of a dragon, right? So in the Greek world, very common. Mesopotamia, of course, over in the Orient, right? Chinese dragon, etc. Europe, this kind of serpentine figures that were commonly understood and believed here in the Greek world of Typhon, right? Typhon, the monster of the great serpent of 100 heads, the Hydra that Hercules fights in his 12 labors, Python or Python, the great serpent, the dragon that Apollo slays and establishes in Delphi, etc. All of this is related to this notion of watchfulness or of gaze, okay? And tying to this idea of imagery of evil, like stalking with the eye and having knowledge, okay? Hence why dragons were commonly portrayed as these wise figures, again, across cultures. And moreover, that in kind of confluence or in relation to that, tied to this predatory sense of a serpent, right, or of a snake, right, that it slithers about, searching out its prey and stalking it, and the gaze as it seeks out its victim is kind of tying all into the symbology of evil itself, right? Again, we can go on and on about that subject. Go ahead.
I understand you're connecting it to
Bewitchment. So here's how. The wording there, again, is used to describe this amulet of the evil eye, which protects against evil, all right? So the connection being drawn is this. As in Paul in this case, sorry, as he describes them as being bewitched, he is describing them as having been sought out by evil, by the evil eye that gazes out looking for its prey and seduces its victim, and kind of like the old image of Pan and leading the kids out of the village with the sweet sound of the flute, and gets seduced off into evil and into corruption and into wickedness. That's this essence of this word of bewitchment as we have it, right? And so to be bewitched, he's not saying that they have literally fallen under a curse. Again, he's using this in a rhetorical sense, right? who has bewitched you, right? You can see the rhetorical essence is pretty obvious because it's in the form of a question, quote unquote, right? A rhetorical question. Who has bewitched you, right? And this is why I was saying earlier in relation when we were talking to that last phrase, before whose eyes Jesus Christ has been publicly proclaimed as crucified, is a play on words. It's a pun, because that inherent essence of evaskanen, of bewitchment, of the evil eye. He then says, who has? It's almost as if he's saying, what evil eye has preyed upon you, whose own eyes beheld Jesus Christ publicly crucified? Do you understand what I mean? He's actually using this kind of play on word with regards to the concept of the eye, right, and knowledge, right? So the bewitchment in this context is in the sense of, again, keeping in mind the concept of the eye in the ancient world used symbolically to describe knowledge and understanding. Who has bewitched you? What spell has been cast on you, as it were, that has taken you from the knowledge of the truth into false knowledge, right? Into lies, right? That movement, right? Especially because you're the ones before whose eyes, knowledge, right? The person of Jesus Christ was proclaimed publicly to you, right? You knew about this, and now you've abandoned what you knew. It's this bewitchment, right? You've been seduced off into falsehood and lies, is the point he's making. He's describing it as a kind of bewitchment on the back of describing them as fools for that reason. Make sense? Yeah.
That would have been very logical back then because people did strongly.
100%. And for good reason, yeah, absolutely. For good reason. And so it's a bewitchment in a kind of sense as well. Just not in a magical sense. It's a genuine bewitchment in the sense of how this phrase is being employed here. Who has bewitched you? It's as if they've been bewitched, right? Having known what was right and true, and now having been carried off into something that so fundamentally contradicts the very core and essence of what they once rightly held. That kind of movement is just like a magic spell. It's like bewitchment. You've just been bewitched. It's this group of people, in this case it's a group, right, but individual group, whatever. This group of people have come in among you, again using a very common ancient phrase which also gets used in the Bible, right? Wolves in sheep's clothing. Again, that was a common phrase in the ancient world. It's why it was used in here. It's why it's still with us in English, right? Those who are like sheep on the outside, they look like you, they talk like you, they walk, but inside they're ravenous wolves. Again, it's all very ancient phraseology. Who have swayed you over in this direction and swayed you off the path of righteousness, right, of truth. It's this bewitchment, especially because it's ultimately sinister, right? The motives of the Judaizers is already partly commented on. He's going to comment on them even further. In fact, when he gets to the very end, that's why this letter to the Galatians really is the quintessential litmus test for any culture or any time period where people are, for lack of a better term, struggling to just speak the truth plainly. Okay? By that, what I mean is we are plagued with nicety at the moment. Not out of the intentional desire to hurt people. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking though about niceties and the apparent meanness of one's comment being the ultimate arbiter as to whether one should be listened to, as opposed to the substance of whether or not it's true or not, right? We suffer from that. Where someone can say something that's accurate, but because the person doesn't like how it was said, or they don't like what was said, then the rebuttal is simply, you're wrong because I don't like that. Well, that means nothing. That means nothing. That's not an argument for anything. It doesn't deal with the substance of what's said, doesn't deal with whether it's accurate. Ultimately, it's a purely emotional argument, right? Where the emotion is actually controlling the faculty of reason, not the other way around, right? Happens all the time. And again, those are cultural things. They develop that way over the course of decades and centuries. And they're influenced by our values, and they therefore influence our values, etc., etc. But getting back to the point here, this book is the perfect litmus test for whether or not one takes truth seriously, because I've met umpteenth people who will deadpan say that he's being quite mean here in calling them foolish and being bewitched, and it's both fortunate and unfortunate that they actually miss the even more dramatically blunt thing that he says at the end of this chapter, which goes in completely over people's heads. In verse 28, we're not going to go into it now because we're obviously going to do that when we get there, right? It's the great irony of Galatians chapter 3, verse 28 is the fact that it's a very endearing sentence, and it actually is, right? It's a powerful sentence, and it is designed and worded impeccably to portray the justice and the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news of Christ, and that his kingdom now extends to us all in his grace, right? The thing is, though, they don't, for reasons that we'll elucidate when we get there, there is an unfathomably insulting thing that he says in that sentence that goes completely over people's heads, okay? Now, he puts an insult in there for a very good reason, again, which we need to build up through chapter 3 to understand why he includes a remarkable insult. But this is kind of my point to finish, is that if one is tempted to have a problem with verse 1, then stop reading, because you're gonna have an aneurysm by the time you get to verse 28, and you're gonna have an aneurysm by the time you get to the end of the book, where he says that it would be better for these people who are demanding that these Celts uphold the Mosaic code, including circumcision, to simply castrate themselves in the process, right? Again, he's not referring to the Galatians as brothers, even though they are. He's not referring to them as fellow servants of Jesus Christ, though they are. He's not referring to them as fellow saints of God, though they are, because he's not interested in patting them on the back and coddling their feelings.
Yes.
Right? There's a context. He does elsewhere.
He's not trying to be nice.
No, he's not trying to be nice, because there is a distinction between kindness and nicety. Again, a word like nice is a very, very obvious example of what I'm talking about, because the word nice, which largely comes over from French into Anglo-Norman and then eventually obviously into English, primarily in the 17th century, it really just comes directly from the French into English, was not originally a positive statement. You didn't want to get called nice.
It's not in the Bible.
And that part too, well, that's only by virtue of the fact that the word really arises in kind of the early modern period, right? So obviously it's not in the, being called nice in the 17th or 18th centuries was not a compliment in French or English, but now it's become almost a virtue. That's how dramatically it's that kind of, without understanding at all. Nicety is not kindness. Those are two distinct things. Kindness is not just the disposition, but really it is compassion in action. Okay, compassion is much more of the ethic, the ethos, the virtue, and kindness is the consequence of compassion. Niceness, if anything, is a consequential vice of cowardice, quite frankly. being kind, being nice are not synonymous. Right? We should be kind because kindness is the outworking of the virtue of compassion, right? Of the ethos of compassion. But is it compassionate to speak nicely to someone who is so evidently in error, especially if that error has serious consequences on their life, right? And on their relationships and everything else. And to simply leave them in that scenario out of the desire to be nice and not mean, is that compassion? Well, the answer is no. It's cruelty. And so when you elevate something like niceness to the status of a virtue when it's not, you end up actually creating an atmosphere of pragmatic cruelty. With the full... Yeah. Fake.
Actually, cosmetic.
Yeah, cosmetic, yeah, because it's not genuine compassion. Again, kindness is the pragmatic outworking of the virtue of compassion, and niceness is ultimately the consequence of cowardice, of not actually having the moral fortitude, the ethical fortitude, to tell someone the truth, even though it may temporarily cause them discomfort or pain, but with the ultimate goal of their well-being and their benefit.
It's quite selfish too, because you're doing it so you don't feel bad, ultimately.
That's the other side of that coin.
It's just so you don't have to feel bad.
So the other side of that coin is, yeah. So that's why I said.
It's easy.
So that's why I said cowardice.
Empty,
Yeah. So that's why I said cowardice ultimately, right? So niceness being the consequence of cowardice is because of that. It's actually ultimately not for. Ultimately, niceness, as it rightly understood, is not actually for the ultimate betterment of the other person. It's actually for the betterment of yourself, of you feeling like you were nice, as well as feeling safe. Yeah, correct. That's what you're about to say. Yeah, correct. Whereas compassion, genuine compassion, is willing to risk temporary discomfort on your or even the other person's side for the sake of their ultimate well-being and benefit and flourishing. So compassion actually takes the risk that a friendship might be impaired, but that the other person's, not yours, the other person's well-being will be the ultimate outcome. So describing niceness as the consequence of cowardice is just that, because compassion actually requires an element of courage. So yeah, again, in one verse there's quite a lot here. That's why we're able to spend a lesson on just one verse. But he then unpacks over the coming verses, obviously, why he asks this rhetorical question of these foolish Galatians as to who has bewitched them. Okay, so cool.